Dear Father, thank you for another time we can spend in previewing the lesson. We've been enjoying Isaiah, the gospel in the Old Testament. We go into one of the remarkable events in Isaiah's storyline, that of King Hezekiah. We pray that somehow we will see your powerful arm and your hand as we open this lesson. Again, make us teachable, make us humble, make us obedient as we study. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So glad to be with you again. Last week we were in a rush because we had to do Pathfinder Bible experience with our kids. Hey, we placed first. We're really excited, but we had to do it within an hour. So I was going 100 miles per hour. Maybe we can rehash some of the stuff that we covered last week. But we go into the fascinating story of Hezekiah, one of the highlights of the book of Isaiah in our study for this week. It cannot be more explicit than the title. It says the defeat of the Assyrians. The Assyrian army was the most ruthless and brutal and vicious army in history, and yet they were defeated by a very small nation, that of Judah. And we will look into that today. Now, as you look forward into what's going to happen after COVID-19, a book just went out entitled COVID-19, The Great Reset. You must have heard about this already if you haven't read the book yet. It was penned by Professor Klaus Schwab. And he said the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. And you know what's going on there. The World Economic Forum with Germany, Prince Charles is part of it. Bill Gates and the bigwigs, so to speak, is planning to move towards globalism, which is a new world government where we can control not only health, but also economics and all the systems in the world from a central location. And he was saying, if no one power can enforce order, our world will suffer from a global order deficit. So some people are saying maybe this is the solution to have more equity in the world. But at the same token, somebody's saying, this will be like control, just a centralized control all over the world. What's going on? Will we lose our freedom? If that's not enough, this is what they've already established, and the World Economic Forum is part of this. They build in the Common Trust Network the Common Pass platform. The Common Pass platform lets individuals present the health information they have access from the Common Trust data sources to demonstrate that they meet the health entry requirements of their destination. I love Zoom because it has given me the opportunity to minister without actually flying to the places. I've been into several countries, literally using Zoom without flying to those countries. So we asked the question, how do I travel after COVID-19? I got news. These are 4 days of what's going to happen. There's a Common Trust Network. You will have a digital certification, so to speak, which will identify you as someone who has been vaccinated with a valid vaccination facility, validly registered, duly registered in the database of this Common Trust Network. So there's a digital identity that's going to be available for everyone, and that will affect travel. You know what happened after 9/11? Things have never been the same. You got security check. Now you got health check, but this will be controlled from a central source, a central network, which is actually part of the features of this World Economic Forum and doing this global reset. So we asked the question, what's going to happen to us? So hopefully as we navigate to Isaiah today and we come into these troubling times, we don't even know how predictable life will be after COVID-19. We'll find some assurance and see how we can rest secure in God the way his people rest secure in him during the time of King Hezekiah in Isaiah. Okay, let me just briefly review this. I like this diagram because it outlines to you the prophets in Judah and Israel. Judah is the southern kingdom, Israel is the northern kingdom, and you have the kings outlined here. And then you got the Assyrian monarchs right at the bottom, so you see Amos, you see Isaiah right there, and you see Jotham and Ahaz, and that's where Hezekiah comes in. That's where and then you see Sennacherib right here. So this is the outside world of God's people. This is the biblical record, and we will look into it in terms of the prophets, in terms of the kings of God's people then. Okay, like we've studied, Isaiah 36:39 is a historical interlude in Isaiah, because they got two parts of Isaiah. You get judgments in the first part, the judgments from God, and the second part of Isaiah is restoration and hope. And right in the middle, 36 to 39, is a story about what happened to Hezekiah in his battle with Sennacherib. Okay, that was about 701 BCE. Sandra Richter calls him the poster child of biblical archaeology. Poster child because we got a ton of archaeological data that validates the existence of King Hezekiah and Sennacherib. And you'll be fascinated. You'll see that later on in our study. We got all the archaeological evidences for it. There are three biblical accounts found in 2 Kings 18 to 19, Isaiah 36 to 38, we already mentioned that, and 2 Chronicles 32. It's a treasure trove of archaeological and epigraphic evidence. Like I said, most of the materials I'm going to be sharing comes from Sandra Richter, which I really respect. And she is very intelligent, very smart, very scholarly. And yet when she communicates in words that is easily understandable in her language. Again, that's part of her study in the Epic of Eden. There's a session on Isaiah, several sessions, actually 10 sessions on Isaiah, just the book of Isaiah. And as she already mentioned before, we covered this last week, Isaiah is divided into two parts. I just mentioned that. And of course, that's summarized in Isaiah 42 verse 9, which is the former things and the latter things, where you got judgment and hope. Okay, and the book addresses three different eras. The first era is Isaiah's lifetime, which is 742 to 700 BC, right about the time was King Uzziah died. And then the exile of the people of Judah in Babylon, 605 to 539 BCE, the 70 years. And then the return of the exile in chapters 56, 66, where Isaiah says, God will rebuild your city, will actually rebuild your paradise, and then there'll be allusions to the coming heaven and new earth that God will be restored. So that there's this eschatology and this apocalyptic taste when we go to the last part of Isaiah. These are the backgrounds of the chapters, which will probably be helpful to you. I don't need to read you can go to the handout and figure this out. But this is what we cover, 36 to 39, which is the historical interlude of the first part, which is judgment, and the second part, which is hope. I find this very helpful. Sandra Richter put this together, patriarchal period from the Garden of Eden, all the way to when you go to the dynasty of Jehu. You get Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdom. You got the Syro-Ephraimite wars in 734 to 732. And 722 is where Israel was sacked and totally destroyed by the Assyrians, and they were deported. And of course, the deportation of the land of Judah into Babylon when we reach 587, 586 BC. To zoom into what our study would be, I circled the three events that I told you. We're going to cover that already. The Syro-Ephraimite wars is the war between Israel and Syria, right up north. Okay? And then obviously after they became really wicked, God allowed them to be destroyed, and they were scattered. That's why you got books on the 10 lost tribes, because the 10 tribes, which is the northern kingdom, were totally wiped out. They were deported, and then the Assyrians brought in some Assyrians to go into Samaria. That's why we got the Samaritans today. We got evidence. It fascinated me when I was studying this, that really not all of the 10 tribes were wiped out, because a lot of them came down to Judah to seek asylum. They were refugees there, and they occupied high positions. We'll look into that later on. So somehow, it's not that we believe that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem and the 10 tribes will believe. A lot of people teach today that the entire nation of Israel, all the 12 tribes will come back and be rebuilt. This is what we call Zionism, and particularly those who believe in dispensationalism and the secret rapture. They think about the end of the world in terms of the rebuilding of the temple and the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But of course, the Bible talks about not a Jerusalem on earth, but the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Just an interest in terms of history, the 10 tribes wasn't really lost because a lot of those tribes went down to Judah, and we'll see that later on when we look at the broad wall that Hezekiah built to defend the citizens of his kingdom. So these are some maps which will be useful. We've always said that there was a northern and southern kingdom in the split, and you know that the capital of the southern kingdom is in Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom had two religious centers, which was in Bethel and Dan. And of course, while the kingdom was split, and they were living their lives into two kingdoms among the people of God, the Assyrians started assuming power in the area, in the region, in the Savant, okay? And we know the story. Wars happened. Syria and Israel tried to attack Judah. You know, we talk about that in Ahaz. But the Assyrians, who actually dominated the inner part of this land, wanted to expand its territory. There's for one simple reason, because the closer you are to the coast, the more trade there will be. There will be more economics. There will be more money and resources. That's why the plan of the Assyrians was to conquer this part of the Middle East. And of course, one of the main capitals of Assyria, aside from Ashur, is Nineveh. Nineveh particularly was where the palace of Sennacherib is in our story today. And I mentioned it, Lachish will be mentioned in our story because Lachish was the second city in Jerusalem during the time of Isaiah. What's the meaning of second city? Second city in America is Chicago. Okay, and you got the Big Apple, which is New York. L.A., New York, and second city is Chicago. It's second city because it's not as big as Jerusalem, and yet it's big. It's big. But you know, they got sacked by Sennacherib, and we'll talk about that too. Here's just a random list of the kings of Assyria to give us historical context for what we're trying to study, okay? I started with Shalmaneser II. He started cutting off Israel there. Adad-Nirari began taking tribute from Israel. And what's interesting is Adad-Nirari had several sons, and one of the sons was Shalmaneser IV. The Assyrians were very proud people, so they made sure that all their conquests, all their military prowess are recorded in artifacts. Their wallpaper were like vicious pictures of how they tortured the people they defeated. So it was very interesting to note that when you start looking at the record of Shalmaneser IV, everything goes dark. It's dark in the sense that there's no record. Why is there no record? And a lot of people are saying Shalmaneser IV was a very weak king. He wasn't as strong and as vicious, you know, as scary, as frightening as the rest of the Assyrian kings. Well, there's probably one reason there. So people surmise this, is that Jonah had to visit to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital, right? And I guess he wasn't the weak king. He probably was a converted king. He turned himself to God, and of course, the preaching was, hey, you behead people, you impale people, you're cruel, you're ruthless. That's not supposed to be the way you treat people. And of course, Isaiah proclaimed this, and they changed their ways. That's why, for so many years, Assyrian history went dark. And that's why they say, when was Jonah's visit? It was more than likely during the reign of Shalmaneser IV. And after that happened, another guy comes into the picture, Tiglath-Pileser, during the time of King Ahaz, okay? And then, of course, after King Ahaz paid tribute, we'll go over that, the first crisis in Isaiah. Shalmaneser V comes in, besieges Samaria, and that's where Israel fell. And then Sargon II finished up what Shalmaneser left off and deported and took Israel captive and scattered it in the Assyrian Empire and repopulated the northern kingdom with the Syrians, okay? And then after that, the highlight of the Syrian monarchy is Sennacherib. Sennacherib comes into the picture. He was the one who invaded Judah, and this is where Isaiah starts our story. Here's a whole list of all the Assyrian kings. If you're interested, it will be part of the handout. So I highlighted Shalmaneser, Assur-Dan, Assur-Nirari. Okay, sir. This is what preceded Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser the fifth. This was the time probably of Jonah, and then during the time of Isaiah and during the time of Hezekiah, we go into Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser, Sargon, and Sennacherib. Those four Assyrian kings, maps to our study in the quarterly. There's another outline that we shared before, which will be very useful if you want to take a look. This is the ministry of Isaiah. It's the ministry of Jeremiah. And there were two crises that was encountered during the ministry of Isaiah. The first crisis was the crisis of King Ahaz, when Samaria connived with Syria to attack him. And there were several sons that were signs that God gave in order for him to be protected, but he didn't follow that. And the other crisis is the crisis of King Hezekiah against Sennacherib. I just highlighted King Manasseh because they say that was the reign where Isaiah died. He was literally sawn in two. It was under the hands of King Manasseh that Isaiah was killed, and he was martyred there. We also covered this. This is the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. This might be useful historical background for you. It's color-coded. You will see the expansion of Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib. Okay, and you see how massive the Assyrian Empire was. Remember, Babylon was only a city, and we'll see that Babylon eventually takes over Assyria and becomes a Babylonian Empire. Okay, what was the deal here? So let's give this more context. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings and used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. This was what was going on. The Canaanites was very immoral, had abominable practices, and God is saying, we got to cleanse the land. There's no way you can be a people, the ancestors of the coming Messiah, and have the culture of the Canaanites. The land is vomiting them. They're almost as wicked as before the flood. And I know in my heart that God used the children of Israel as an instrument of judgment and punishment for a very wicked world during the time of the Israelites and when they went to Canaan. One of the things that they did was they offered their sons and their daughters to Molech. And the way they do the ritual is they heat up Molech in a furnace until the arms of this idol becomes very hot. And they place the infant in the arms of Molech, the burning arms, or metal arms of Molech. And of course, the baby's gonna scream in pain. But while they're doing that, people will be shouting and screaming and singing so that they will drown the cry of the baby. This is terrible if you start reading this. But aside from that, there was temple prostitution. There was immorality going on. They were also practicing divination and omens. They were dealing with the devil alongside their idolatry. It was bad. You're talking about filling the cup of God's anger. It was right there. That's why, therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. And this is the routes. These are the routes that you follow. Where in the purple, this was the deportation of Tiglath-Pileser after the conquest of Israel. He brought all those Israelites in the northern kingdom to be slaves to populate the Assyrian cities up north. And then the green part is the area conquered by Tiglath-Pileser. And then the red arrows talks about the deportation by Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. It took all of them guys to go there. And there's another deportation by Sargon II. So either after the Assyrians cruelly hurts you, burns down and torches your cities, they take you as their slaves and take you into exile. I like to repeat and give this graphic to you again so you can see a big bird's eye view of what's going on. We start with Abraham all the way to the monarchy and David. That's Isaiah 1-39, covering the Assyrian reign. You have the split of the kingdom and the Assyrian reign where Israel falls. Okay, part of where Babylon takes over the empire because he defeats Assyria through Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar. Covered it in Esther and Nehemiah before. Judah falls under the Babylonian reign. So we covered that in chapters 40 to 55. And of course, 56 to 66 is the promise of the return. They will come back from the Babylonian exile so that the Messiah will be born into his people, among his people, and the world can be saved through him. I included this. You just download this in the handout. So you will see the prophets before the exile, during the exile, and after the exile. So you read this term when you study the Old Testament, the pre-exilic, the post-exilic prophets, and the exilic prophets. And these are the list of the list of all the prophets in those time periods. Where is Isaiah? Isaiah ministered to Judah, right about 740 BC, right, and he warned about the Babylons coming and conquering Judah and destroying Judah because of their unfaithfulness to God. Okay, so we mentioned there were two crises. This is a better layout. These are the chapters right here that you will see. You got oracles, is the calling of Isaiah, and you got Tiglath-Pileser and Ahaz and Pekah. They connive so that they will attack Judah. And Ahaz did not listen to Isaiah, although Isaiah promised that the Lord will defend him. He did not listen. He's got his own strategy. We studied chapters 13 to 35 last week, which are the oracles of judgment. And then our study is crisis number 2, which is King Hezekiah and Sennacherib. Okay, crisis 1 has something to do with Tiglath-Pileser and Ahaz and Pekah, and crisis 2 has something to do with Sennacherib and Hezekiah. There's two main stories in Isaiah. Okay, what's the crisis 1 in Isaiah? Just briefly review this. There were 3 prophecies. There were 3 children in the first crisis. You go, Shear-Jashub, and the prediction was obviously in 65 years your enemies will be gone. Okay, and Emmanuel, you studied that in 13 years. When the kid is able to know what's right and what's wrong, he'll be eating honey. Basically, he's saying that when the kid is about 13 years old, your enemies will be defeated by God. God's going to subjugate your enemy. And of course, the third son is Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, the son of Isaiah, and within 2 years, the enemy will fall, okay? Right about the time the kid is able to say mommy, okay? And let's just go through that. Prophecy 1, Prophecy 2, and Prophecy 3. These are the names of the sons, okay, during the time of Ahaz. And then it said, you will see that in Isaiah's first prophecy, in Isaiah 7:8, there were the importation of foreigners into Israel. Okay, remember, they were taken into captivity. And then the destruction of Israel happened in 722 BC. And then the plundering of Israel was from Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, swift to the spoil, quick to the plunder. In 2 years, the enemies of God were wiped out. This is the story. Remember, we don't have to go over there because you started this. Isaiah went to Ahaz. Don't worry about your enemies. Don't worry about Syria and Israel because the Lord will defend you. In fact, ask a sign from God. And Ahaz said, no, I don't need a sign. I don't want to test God. He was trying to play good. Well, when in fact, he already had a strategy in mind. What was his strategy? No, I will not listen to you, Prophet Isaiah. Instead, I will go to Assyria and pay tribute to Assyria so Assyria can protect me. And Assyria is a lot stronger than Syria and Israel. That's what happened. And because of what happened, he started conniving with Assyria instead of depending on God. And King Ahaz cut off the borders of the bases and removed the laver from off them and took down the sea from off the brazen oxen that were under it and put it upon a pavement of stone. What are these stories? He's saying he went up to Assyria, took the altar in Assyria, took the religious practices and brought them with him. And he changed the furnishings of the temple in Jerusalem. These are in your face, the audacity of this king. And what did he do? He destroyed all the furnitures. And in place of them, they put the idolatrous furniture of the Assyrian religion into the temple courts of God. And the covered place for the Sabbath that they have built in the house in the king's entry without turned he unto the house of the Lord because of the king of Assyria. How it's it? So basically, in order for him to be protected, he literally sold the people of God to this heathen king. And that's the god Molech. In fact, according to the records in 2 Kings 16:3, King Ahaz even burned his son as an offering according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Even his own son was offered as a sacrifice. That big no-no. Says God, you should not be doing that. You got to understand, Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. How did Hezekiah survive? Why was he not offered by King Ahaz to Molech? That's a good story there. Of course, this is not found in the Bible. It's only found in the Jewish writings. Supposedly, the mother of Hezekiah got salamander's blood and then wiped his entire body with salamander's blood. And the belief during the time was salamander was waterproof. And although Ahaz offered Hezekiah because he had salamander's blood all over him, he wasn't burned. I don't think that's true because they did the research. Salamander's blood is not waterproof. And after significant research, they said that what happened was when they were trying to grab some logs, the salamander lives in those logs. And then when they throw this log into the fire, the salamander comes out. And supposedly they say the salamander is waterproof. But that's not true. The whole issue is somehow the mother of Hezekiah was able to preserve Hezekiah from his insane and idolatrous dad, who is Ahaz. Okay? And we talk about syncretism. This was the problem that Ahaz introduced in the land of Israel. He was in the land of Judah. He introduced the religion of the Assyrians and he mixed it with the religion of God. And that's worse. Might as well just go all the way and be wicked and be like the Assyrians. Do not corrupt the worship of Yahweh within the temples of Jerusalem. This is another graphic to help us out. We are in the historical parenthesis between the condemnations and judgment on the left, then prophecies of comfort on the right. So we will cover now the three lessons that we will learn from Hezekiah's life. Okay, the first lesson we will find in his life is radical worship. And Ahaz slept with his fathers. Eventually Ahaz died, and they buried him in the city in Jerusalem, for they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. Well, so Ahaz dies, but because of what he did, ransacked the temple, corrupted the tabernacle, the court system, the furnace, it just unforgivable what he did. In your face blasphemy before God. They did not bury him in the tomb of the kings. He was not worthy of that honor. That's what it's saying. That in his place, after he died, King Hezekiah assumes the throne. Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old, and when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, or Abijah, Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. I already told you the story about the tradition that it was Abi who took care of Hezekiah so he doesn't get killed by his own father, who actually practiced the detestable practice of offering babies to Molech. Something very interesting with what Hezekiah did. He destroyed all the idols that his dad, his father, brought into Jerusalem and restored the temple. And what part of what he did was, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David, his father, had done. He removed the high places, broke the pillars, and cut down the Asherah. It's basically, let's get rid of all these abominable things in this land. This is God's land. This is God's people. We have no place for all these detestable and unclean practices and implements that we've taken from Assyria. In fact, I find it's very interesting. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called nehushtan. Nehushtan, you remember in Numbers, people were dying because they were complaining to God, and God took away the heads around them. And you know what they did? The scorpions and the snakes came and started biting them, and people were dying of snake bites. And God told Moses to build the brazen serpent, a snake brass, and the deal was, if you look at the serpent, if you look at the brazen serpent, you will live, you will not die of the snake bites. So for some reason, they kept that snake. In fact, you see that today in Mercury, in drugstore, a symbol of medicine, so to speak. They kept the snake. But because of the practices of the Canaanites, they turned that snake into an idol. And when Hezekiah took rulership of Judah, he said, no way. Not because it was a religious artifact during the time of Moses. You can worship it. I'll be destroying it too. It's a very big wake-up call for us. It is possible for us to have an idol within the church itself. You know, the moment we treat things more important than God, I don't want to be very cynical here, but money sometimes, even the church building, can be more important than God, and that turns into a nehushtan that we need to break for the sake of the glory of God. I'll just go past this. They started the list of the gods, Palestinian deities in the scripture, Palestinian deities in Babylon here, okay, Bel Marduk, and these are the other gods in the area which were not recorded in the Bible. For your purposes, you can just download them and you can read them. What's the first and second commandment? They basically say, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. We talked about that in Fil-Am and Pesach last week. Remember, for people who are arguing, why in the world do we have pictures in church? You go to the general conference, you have a ton of portraits and you got a lot of pictures there. Aren't we violating the second commandment? No, you're not reading the second commandment right, because the word used in you do not make for yourself a graven image is the word pesel. It specifically talks about a statue, a carved image that people bow down to. You should not make a carved image. That's what it's saying in the second commandment. That's the context. That they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. We talk about Bolek, okay? And then Harold Best says, of course, as long as this world endures, everybody inhabiting it is bowing down and serving something or someone, an artifact, a person, an institution, an idea, a spirit, or God through Christ. In fact, it's part of the book Unceasing Worship. Harold Best is saying, we are not born to worship. It's more than that. We are born worshiping. The kid wakes up at night, he wants all the attention to himself. He's telling his mom and his dad, don't sleep, you feed me. If he were not as helpless, he'd probably destroy the entire house. But that's the way we are. So we're worshiping ourselves. And until God changes us and redeems our worship will not be directed towards the right object, namely God. John Calvin says the human heart is a factory of idols. Every one of us from his mother's womb is expert in inventing idols. Tim Keller says whatever we worship most captures our imagination and heart. I define sin as building your identity, your self-worth, and happiness on anything other than God. What I'm doing here? I'm saying not because we're not part of the ancient Near East, where all this heathen, detestable practices that the Canaanites were doing, it's no longer here. We're already civilized. We're not doing that. Oh, we're more sophisticated now. Our gods are not as gruff during the time of Sennacherib and all in Tiglath-Pileser, but we have our own gods. It's a more sophisticated God. Anything that captures our imagination and heart more than God as our God. Let's look at the commentary of Tim Keller. If you center your life and identity on your spouse, you will be emotionally dependent, jealous, and controlling. The other person's problems will be overwhelming to you. Tim Keller is saying, even good things can become God, because if those good things replaces the priority and the preeminence of God in your life, they become your own idols. And one of the idols that you can have is your family, your spouse. Your spouse can be more important than God. And what happens? You become very jealous. Instead of building the family, you destroy the family. If you center your life and identity in your family and children, you will try to live your life through your children until they resent you or have no self on their own. At worst, you may abuse them when they displease you. Why? Because if you run your life based on your kids, one of these days they're going to disappoint you, and everything that you do will be meaningless to you and counterproductive. If you center your life and identity on your work and career, you will be a driven workaholic and a boring, shallow person. At worst, you will lose family and friends, and if your career goes poorly, develop deep depression. These are the gods, the substitute gods that we have. If you center your life and identity on money and possessions, you'll be eaten up by worry or jealousy about money. You'll be willing to do unethical things to maintain your lifestyle, which will eventually blow up your life. But these were good, being responsible to earn a living for your family to survive, loving your family, loving your spouse. These are good. But if it replaces God, it comes back to you and eventually destroy you. If you center your life and identity on pleasure, gratification, and comfort, you will find yourself getting addicted to something. You become a codependent. You will become chained to the escape strategies by which you avoid the hardness of life. If you center your life and identity on relationships and approval, you will be constantly overly hurt by criticism and thus always losing friends. You will fear confronting others and will be a useless friend. If your God is popularity, you want everybody to be pleased by you. And if somebody gets disappointed and criticize you, there you start breaking apart. If you center your life and identity on religion and morality, you will, if you are living up to your moral standards, be proud, self-righteous, and cruel. And if you don't live up to your moral standards, your guilt will be utterly devastating. What am I saying? The first lesson we learn in this Hezekiah and Isaiah is radical worship. Radical worship means to get rid of anything else that stands in the way of God being number one in our lives. As important as other things are, they cannot take the place of God. God must be first, and that's what Hezekiah learned. He destroyed all the temples, threw them away, and replaced them with the right kind of worship that we owe to God alone. So the second lesson we find in Hezekiah is neglectful pride. Okay? In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. Oh, by the way, when you read Isaiah 36 to 38, it's not in chronological order. Actually, Hezekiah gets sick first before the attack and the siege of Sennacherib. It'll be a lot clearer when we proceed with the lesson. But the bottom line is we begin with Isaiah 38:1. I'm trying to give this to you so that you find it chronologically. Hezekiah became very sick. In fact, he was so sick, he was dying. So he prayed to the Lord, please, O Lord, remember how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with the whole heart and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly before the Lord, and God heard his prayer and he healed Hezekiah. Remember, there was a big sign. The shadow of the sundial was brought back 10 steps. And that was the sign that God will be healing Hezekiah, adding 15 years more to his life. Okay. After that happened, Merodach-Baladan, let me give a historical background of Merodach-Baladan here, who happened to be the ruler of Babylon then, sent his emissaries, because they were studying the stars. The Babylonians were into astronomy and astrology, sent their emissaries to talk to Hezekiah and said, nuts, we saw what happened in the sky. How did that happen? How did your God do that? They were asking, explaining to us. But really, the purpose of Merodach-Baladan was to go against Assyria. Okay, since he was already king of Babylon, he recaptured Babylon when the father of Sennacherib died. He said, come on, Hezekiah, come with me. Let's revolt against the Assyrians and let's defeat them. So what did Hezekiah do? He showed his possessions, his army, his arsenal, and the gold and the riches that he has to prove that he can be a good ally with Merodach-Baladan and they can defeat the Assyrians. This is what the historians and archaeology said. Hezekiah was a part of this great scheme. Taking opportunity from the king's recovery, Merodach-Baladan sent sick visitors with a gift and a letter. We are not told what the letter contained, but we do know how Hezekiah reacted, giving the envoys a conducted tour of his storerooms, money, and arsenals. The letter was manifestly an invitation to become a partner in a rebellion, and Hezekiah fell for it. So it was not just boasting about what kind of possessions he had in the kingdom, how rich his kingdom was. They were strategizing to go against the enemy. Here again, Hezekiah fails to trust God. That's why he was an almost faithful king. In the end, he was not really that faithful. Instead of trusting God, he wanted to be an ally of Merodach-Baladan or Babylon to go Assyria. So this is what happened. Isaiah said, "Hey, I heard you had visitors. What happened when these Babylonians visited you?" And Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." All right, put that in context. He did that so that he can prove that he's a strong force that can join with Babylon to conquer Assyria. "Behold," Isaiah said, "because you did that, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord." Because of what you did, the Babylonians will remember what they saw, and they will come back to take and loot all the treasures that you have here. "And some of your own sons who shall be born to you shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of Babylon." We know about this. Daniel and his friends became leaders in Babylon, but they became eunuchs in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar, because they turn you into eunuch once you become a cabinet, part of the cabinet, the king, so that you don't mess up with the king's harem. So we know what happened. This is the sieges of Jerusalem in 605 BC. Daniel and the princes were taken captive. In 597, Ezekiel was taken with 10,000 captives. And 586, they totally wipe out Jerusalem, destroying the temple, looting the temple, bringing all the vessels to the temple of Marduk in Babylon. And they tied those whoever survived that military conquest and military campaign that sacked the city, burned down the city, ravaged all the women and the children. Whoever survived, they were tied one after the other to be deported to the exile in Babylon. "The whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and this nation shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years, just because they became unfaithful to God." I kind of included this because this is a saying of our national hero in the Philippines: "Ang hindi marunong lumingon sa kanyang pinanggalingan na hindi makakarating sa kanyang paroroan." He who doesn't know how to look back to where he came from will never arrive at his destination. This is talking about gratitude. We got to learn to look back and see what we owe to those before us. We have nothing to fear for the future, says Ellen White in Testimonies, Volume 9, page 10, "except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." We know this. We learned this by heart. And that's what Hezekiah did. He forgot what God has done for him. He was dying. He didn't even tell them about the power and the grace of his God that was given to him. Instead, he tried to prove that he was strong to be an ally in another revolt. Alfaro Aguirre, I had to share this with you. I think one of the most powerful words that I read is of a former mayor in the Philippines. Ang pinakamasamang tao sa balat ng lupa ay ang taong hindi marunong tumanaw ng utang na loob. The worst person on the face of the earth is one who doesn't know how to be grateful. And that's the problem with us sometimes. Like Hezekiah, despite the miracles and the blessings that God gives upon our life, we forget God and prove that how good we are and boast and be prideful to other people. But look at Jesus, by pouring the whole treasure of heaven into this world, by giving us in Christ all heaven. God has purchased the will, the affections, the mind, and the soul of every human being. Christ Object Lessons 3:25, one of the most precious writings that I read from Ellen White. And of course, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:19, "You are not your own. You were bought by a price. With the price, so glorify God in your body." Why don't we own ourselves? Because it was God who purchased us in Jesus Christ. Well, really, God can say, "Hezekiah, I was the one who purchased your life. Without me, you will not be living right now in debt." But he forgot it. Ingratitude is the leprosy of the soul. It eats away on the inside, destroys our happiness, cripples our joy, withers our compassion, paralyzes our praise, and renders us numb to all the blessings of God. Don't ever forget the death of Christ. To the death of Christ we owe even this earthly life. The bread we eat is the purchase of his broken body. The water we drink is bought by his spilled blood. Never one saint or sinner eats his daily food, but he is nourished by the body and the blood of Christ. The cross of Calvary is stamped on every loaf. It is reflected in every water spring. Very eloquent words from Ellen White, but this tells you nothing that goes to your mouth, nothing that you enjoy in life is yours. It was purchased by the blood of Jesus for you to be able to survive and even move in your existence. So we go to the last lesson in our study, which is the lesson of obedient prayer. Hezekiah prayed when Sennacherib came back, because if you look at the story, what happened was basically after Merodach-Baladan reconquered Babylon to be the ruler, he challenged Sennacherib, and Sennacherib came and destroyed Babylon. He won Babylon back from Merodach-Baladan. He ran away again. Okay, so the plan of revolt with Hezekiah did not continue. But after Sennacherib sacked Babylon, he proceeded in the west so that he can attack Judah now to attack Hezekiah. And that's where the third lesson that we gain from Hezekiah's life comes in. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nation delivered them? The Rabshakeh, supposedly. This is the high-ranking official of Sennacherib. He sends them via propaganda to King Hezekiah. He's basically saying, let's not waste resources and then plunder. Instead of plundering, why don't you just go ahead and surrender now? That way we don't have to destroy you. We can use whatever resources that you have. As long as you pay tribute to us, be our slaves, we'll be fine. And you think you can go against me? He says Sennacherib to the Rabshakeh, no. He said, look at what Assyria has done to his enemies. We'll show that in a little while. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers, and he read it. And when Hezekiah read the letter from Sennacherib, this is a large empire going against a small nation, what's the thing that he did? Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread that letter before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord and said, so now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. What an amazing prayer. He went to God and said, Lord, I need your protection. I need your defense. Please come and help us as a nation, not for our sake, but so that they may know that you alone are God. This is reminiscent of David. He wasn't fighting for himself. So that you will know that there's a God of Israel, that you cannot blaspheme. I'm going to kill you today, so he said to Goliath. Okay, let's see why this was very disconcerting to Hezekiah. These are some relics, archaeological digs that the Assyrians showed. Every time they conquer something, they record their conquest in other carvings or whatever, in that artwork. They send it back to Nineveh or Ashur, and they make this wallpaper. The wallpaper of the king is a picture of all their conquests. Look at this. This is a picture of dismembered victims of Shalmaneser III becoming grisly ornaments on a temple gate. Look at this. They cut off all the extremities of the people. Here, there are 3 stakes here, each with 8 male heads standing like human totem poles outside the conquered city. And look at this. This is 6 human heads in a pole. This is part of the picture. How can you eat with this? The Assyrians did this. But what are they trying to do? They show this to their enemies. So this Rabshakeh, look at what we have done to all these nations. We're going to do the same thing to you. That's very terrifying. Then, oops. I didn't go dark. These are piled heads collected inside the tent in the relief. This is a carving, archaeological carving from the reign of Ashurbanipal. More heads are carried by soldiers wading to the decapitated bodies of their enemies. Look at this. There are heads all over the place. They're stepping on the heads that they decapitated their enemies. That's the reason why they were the most vicious, the most terrifying empire. When people saw this, they didn't dare to go against Assyria because they will be terrorized the way other people have been terrorized, that Assyria has been defeated. These are reliefs from Sennacherib's palace, portray the Assyrian soldiers dismembering men from the biblical city of Lachish by peeling off their skin, decapitating their heads, and cutting off their hands. The Rabshakeh goes to Hezekiah. You think you can escape from us? Not even your gun can protect you. If you don't surrender to us, we got to do the same thing. We're going to peel your skin. We're going to flay you. We got to chop off your heads. This is another story. Two Assyrian soldiers erect a stake with an impaled naked man beside two others. The heads of these captured men of Lachish sag forward, suggesting that they are already dead. Oh boy, when you're pushed to an extreme, you're about to die. What do? Hezekiah went to the temple and laid everything to the Lord. And he committed everything to the Lord. Very typical of one of my favorite illustrations during the days when we still were able to fly. Some people still fly today, but when we could fly freely with COVID, you always see this warning in case of a fire in an aircraft. You must leave everything, leave your bags behind. And remember the overhead bin, your carry-on when you go to the plane. And something happened that the TWA 843, in fact, had caught fire in a runway. And Stuart McAllister had this note in the post. He said, I do find it disgusting that these people all value their hand luggage above the other passengers' life. The aeronautics agency said, you have 90 seconds to vacate the plane. Because typically within 90 seconds, the plane's going to explode and you're going to die. So what you need to do is escape as soon as you can. You leave everything behind. But what did these guys do? They went to the overhead bins and grabbed their things, and they blocked the way people were able to go out. He said, I find it disgusting that people cared more about their possessions than their lives. That's why I love these two quotes from C.S. Lewis. You never know how much you really believe anything until it's truth or false. It becomes a matter of life and death to you. You never know God is all you need until God is all you have. That's a lesson in Hezekiah. The third lesson, basically, when you're at your wit's end, you're at the end of your rope. That's the time to turn to God and give everything to God. Maybe that's the reason why our lives, our Christian lives, are not really flourishing, and it's not as fervent as it should be, because we do not treat our relationship with God and the world as a matter of life and death. It's life and death because Jesus had to give his life so that we can live. Okay, so we now have crisis 1 and crisis 2. Isaiah right in the middle. We talk about Tiglath-Pileser, who messed up the temple worship and messed up the religion of the Israelites. God was not only taken aside, he was actually abused and corrupted by this king. And Hezekiah comes in to reform the Judah, and then Sennacherib comes to attack him. So he's the background. Sennacherib defeats Merodach-Baladan and retakes the city of Babylon in 702 BC. He then proceeds to attack Judah. Remember what we said? Merodach-Baladan reconquered Babylon, okay, before when Sennacherib assumed the throne, because right after the death of Sennacherib's father, the Assyrian kingdom became weak. So they thought they can conquer Assyria. But he was sacked by Sennacherib right here. So Sennacherib hits Babylon right here, and then he moves towards the west so that he can attack Judah now. So if you want to go to the flow, Rabshakeh delivers his message in verse 36, surrender or be deported, okay, or you'll be terrorized. Hezekiah goes to the house of Yahweh. Isaiah gives words of comfort and deliverance to Isaiah. There was a second message from the Rabshakeh, the high-ranking official of Sennacherib. Assyria is greater than all the gods. Not even your gods can protect you. Now, how dare these guys. It really got to their head. Hezekiah's prayer before the Lord in chapter 37, 14 to 20. And Isaiah gives words of judgments against Assyria. Okay, here comes the lesson that we got to learn. Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, but he did not pray in laziness. He prayed in obedience. Why? Because he knew that Sennacherib was coming and he will put the siege around Jerusalem. They will siege is putting a perimeter around you so you cannot move out. So when that happens, what the what the city or the nation that's being attacked will do is to get ready so they have enough supply so they can survive within their city. They cannot go out because they will be under siege. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. The water supply of Judah was in above ground aqueduct, and they had complete water supply from the Gihon springs. And Hezekiah is saying, oh, no, that will not work. If the Assyrians come and they put the Jerusalem under siege, we don't want to have access to water. When they have access to water and we run out of water, we're going to die instead of them living. So what he said that what we need to do is get that water supply out so they won't have water while they're out there trying to put us under siege. Instead, I'll reroute the water and I'll go underground. The same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David, and Hezekiah prospered in all his works. This is the fascinating part. I'll use Sandra Richter's archaeological finds here. In the 8th century archaeology of Judah, they found what we call now the Fil-Am tunnel with the Fil-Am inscription. Remember the Fil-Am tunnel? Jesus heals a blind man and asked the blind man to wash in the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam is the end of the water system that Hezekiah built. And that marvelous feat of engineering had an inscription. Of course, you get an engineering feat, you got to document that, okay? On the basis of the 14C dates, it can be concluded that the Fil-Am tunnel was most probably constructed in about 700 BC. Look at the inscription. Right about the time Hezekiah was ruling, okay? And then they did the radiometric measurements. The Fil-Am tunnel age of about 700 BC agrees well with the paleographic age suggested for the Fil-Am inscription. That inscription is also 700 BC when they did the radiometric analysis. Given the fashion of ancient kings to publicly commemorate the completion of waterworks projects, one would expect the Fil-Am tunnel inscription to have been attributed by its presumed royal sponsor, King Hezekiah of Judah, but this was not the case. On the contrary, instead of mentioning the royal patron, the epigraph celebrates its builders. See this inscription right by Hezekiah's tunnel. The Fil-Am tunnel did not credit the building of the tunnel to Hezekiah. Instead, it credited the building to the builder. Let's see why could that have happened. See the boring. This is literal translation from the inscriptions that the archaeologists found. And this was the manner of the boring. While the stonemasons were still striking with the pickaxe, each man towards his comrade, and when they were still 3 ells or 1.35 meters to bore through, there was heard the voice of a man shouting to his comrade as there was a resonance in the rock in the south and in the north. Here's what happened. Hezekiah told Judah, Sennacherib is coming, the Assyrians is coming, and we cannot give them water. But we need water supply within Judah. So you know what we need to do? Let's build a tunnel. And they built the tunnel through rocks by digging to the rocks. And he asked volunteers, and he had 2 teams trying to build this. From one end, there's the Fil-Am pool, and then the Gihon springs on the other. And they met while they were digging this. Okay, by doing this, water was assured while the siege was on, and the citizens and residents of Judah can be supplied with whatever water they need. And on the day of the boring, the stonemasons had struck each towards his own comrade, pickaxe against pickaxe. Then the water ran from the spring to the pool for 1,200 ells, for 540 meters, and 100 ells, 45 meters, was the height of the rock over the heads of the stonemasons. This is fascinating. While they were digging, they met each other, according to the record. And they finally broke through, the tunnel was complete, and the water gushed, and it became available to the city. So if you want to summarize the findings in archaeology, our dating agrees well also with the date commonly assigned to King Hezekiah, whom the biblical text describes as having constructed the Fil-Am tunnel, the 3 independent lines of evidence radiometric dating, paleography, which is the inscription, and the historical record, all converge on about 700 BC, rendering the Fil-Am tunnel the best dated Iron Age biblical structure thus far known. One of the greatest engineering feats documented by archaeology outside of the scriptures, verifying that what we have there in the tunnel was built by Hezekiah. And the people of Israel and Judah who lived in the cities of Judah also brought in the tithe of cattle and sheep and the tithe of the dedicated things that had been dedicated to the Lord their God and laid them in heaps. So they gave this text because this is very important. I want to stress this. Look at the text in 2 Chronicles 31:6. The people of Israel and Judah. What does that mean? Although Israel was wiped out in 722 BC, there were still Israelites from the northern kingdom living in the land of Judah, in the southern kingdom. What does that suggest? It only suggests that somehow these people went and became refugees from the north when the Assyrians were attacking the northern kingdom, and they started living right there in Judah, in the southern kingdom. In fact, in 2017, they had digs. They found bullays. Bullays are seals of scrolls. And in the hundreds upon hundreds of scrolls they found in the digs, the archaeological digs, which had names from the northern kingdom, high-ranking officials in Judah, which suggests that there were a lot of refugees from the northern kingdom who started living in the southern kingdom. And this is, I think, what happened. This is where Hezekiah's palace and most of the residents were. And the refugees from the northern kingdom started living right in the suburbs of where Hezekiah was. This was Hezekiah's, and that was the western wall. And because Sennacherib was about to attack and lay siege on Jerusalem, Hezekiah needed to protect all of his residents, including those refugees. So he started building what we call Hezekiah's broad wall, to protect even the refugees, including Jerusalem. And we studied this when we were in Esther and Nehemiah. Remember when they rebuilt the walls? Part of the walls that was rebuilt was the broad wall of Hezekiah. This was the blueprint of what was going on. Let's see the tunnel that he built right there on the southeastern side. But this is the broad wall that he had to build. This was very, very wide wall. And you know what? It's amazing. They said that the wall was designed by engineers, according to the archaeologists. They must know engineering. But when you look into how the walls were filled, they didn't pour concrete. Anything was put in there. It's as if like they were telling the residents of Judah, hey, whatever you have, they've already designed the shell of the wall. Throw in everything there so we can have strong walls and we will not be attacked by the enemy. Okay. Before I go farther, all I'm trying to say is despite the fact that Hezekiah begged God to defend them and he believed that God will defend them, he did not sit and not do anything. Instead, he started building a tunnel, building walls. He was obedient while he was praying. One final evidence in archaeology is the lamelic jars with the royal stamp of Hezekiah filled with oil, wine, and grain. This is a jar, and I think the jar, based on the research, were filled with oil, wine, and grain. These are survival food, okay? And there is the royal stamp of Hezekiah right there. You see that? And the place of origin where this was made. They found a ton of these jars because they were getting ready for the siege. So they had survival kits with them. And there's a ton of these were found in Lachish that fell into the hands of Sennacherib. Of course, they found this also in Jerusalem. But this is again proof that during the time of Hezekiah, they were getting ready for the siege. It's interesting to note, and I give this as an illustration, Leonard Wood was one of the celebrated military generals of the United States, and he went to the King of France, and on his visit, the King of France invited him to go to dinner with him. So it was a big honor. And Leonard Wood shows up, and the King of France said, "What are you doing here? Your Highness, Your Excellency, you invited me." Hey, but you didn't answer the invitation. This was the answer of Leonard Wood. This is terrific. We should probably lead our life this way. Your Excellency, the King's invitation is never to be answered, but to be obeyed. When God tells you something, we're not talking about answering God, but we're talking about obeying. We're at your disposal. Lord, we will do whatever you can. And then finally, the fascinating part of our story, you know what happened? When the Assyrians put Jerusalem under siege, of course they got the tunnel now, they got the water supply, they got the food that they need because of the Lamech jars, okay? And they got the broad wall that kind of protects all of Jerusalem now. They already prepared for the siege of Jerusalem. How did God intervene? According to we'll go back to according to the Bible, that night, one angel was sent by God, and that one angel wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Okay, so that's where do you find that in the historical records? Of course, it's a miraculous record. Secular history won't record that. Okay, but there is evidence for that. They found the Taylor Prism, okay, where Sennacherib himself described what happened. As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities, as well as the small cities in their area, which were without number, by leveling with battering rams and by bringing up siege, I besieged and took them. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, because he was under siege, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city, in addition to the 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, which he had brought after me to Nineveh, my royal city, to pay tribute and accept servitude. He dispatched his messengers. You read this in Kings. This is what happened. So Merodach-Baladan wanted to go against Assyria, and he tried Hezekiah to join him in the revolt. But Sennacherib defeats Merodach-Baladan. He runs away. And then Sennacherib approached Judah and sent the Rabshakeh to Hezekiah. And Hezekiah said, I was just kidding. I didn't want to go against you. And so, okay, if you're just kidding, send me all the tributes. And 2 Kings tells you that Hezekiah grabbed a ton of stuff, a lot of treasure to give as a tribute to Sennacherib. And that's when he started going to God and praying that he be defended by God. Okay, so that's it. That is documented. That is documented within this Taylor Prism. Okay, this is one thing very interesting though. You know, the Assyrians were proud. They always display the booties, again, the trophies of their conquest. Why is there no picture or inscription that somehow they ransacked Jerusalem? Nothing. All it's saying, yes, Hezekiah paid tribute, and then they went home. Sennacherib went home. Nothing happened. They weren't even able to go into Jerusalem. Of course, he was proud. He didn't say that. But the evidence is right here. Nowhere in the records when they put a city in the siege that they do not attack the city and ransack the city. But he did not. What did he do? He went back home. Right? Herodotus, the historian, has a version and says, as the two armies lay here opposite to one another, there came in the night a multitude of field mice, which devoured all the quivers and bowstrings of the enemy and ate the thongs by which they managed their shields. So this is a secular reference. It's saying, why in the world did the Assyrians go back as strong as an army they are? Oh, because something went strange at night. This is an Egyptian explanation. Supposedly, this mice was one of the gods of the Egyptians, and the mice went into the Assyrian camp. What did the mice do? They devoured all the weapons that they had, you know, the quivers and the bowstrings. How can you fight without your weapons? That's why they went home. That's what Herodotus said. What does the Bible say? The Bible say, and the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. This is very fascinating. Why? Let me summarize what we discovered. In the scriptures, it says an angel came, and 185,000 soldiers of Assyrian soldiers were wiped out by one angel of God. Do I have proof in the secular sources? Yes, the Taylor Prism. Sennacherib says, oh, I was there. I caged Hezekiah like a bird because he was under siege. After boasting, he couldn't provide any evidence that he went into Jerusalem. Instead, he went back home. Why will a vicious, a barbaric, terrorizing king just go back without going in? Or something happened. And then Herodotus was the Egyptian version. Oh, mice came and ate up all their weapons, their bowstrings and their quivers? Of course, from our staff, because we're doing Bible study, we believe that God intervened. And God said, this guy's going to go home. I'm going to take care of you, Hezekiah. That's what happened. One angel came, 185,000 was destroyed. By the way that he came, said God, by the same he shall return. And he shall not come into the city, declares the Lord, for I will defend the city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. It's funny because I was looking at this study for the all Isaiah, being intrigued. I've read Isaiah before, but it's not only now that I really come to appreciate what Isaiah is all about. Look at the history of Isaiah, chapters 1 to 39, the first part, and chapters 40 to 66. These were all about judgments because of the wickedness of Israel and Judah. And just about the time when we think that everything is falling apart because they were wicked, there's a breath of fresh air. Somehow Hezekiah was good. And for that one simple blip in that historical record, in the timeline, the Lord intervened. And Judah won. And of course, they eventually fell to Babylon. But that was because Hezekiah went to God and prayed. And God defended him and fought for him, not for his own sake, but for the sake of God. So there's one lesson that I'd like to stress here as we wrap up here. There's a verse that I love in 1 Corinthians 15:10. Paul says, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, says Paul. Get all the apostles. Nobody has worked harder than me. I work harder than me. But he didn't enter. He wasn't boasting. He basically, yet not I. But the grace of God, that was with me. What am I trying to say here? So many times we look at grace as just forgiving grace. You hear that in the churches. We preach that, we study that, and we talk about grace. God will forgive me despite of what has happened. But grace is not only forgiving grace in the Bible. Grace is also empowering grace. When you believe the grace of God, you will be empowered to do stuff that is normally not possible for you to do. And you know what happens when you do that? When you pray to God, like Isaiah, lay all the letters to him and commit everything to God, you will work harder than any one of them as you obey him in prayer and follow his heart. What did God say? For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. All of this victory and all of this wonderful accounts that we see happened not for the sake of Judah, not for the sake of Hezekiah alone, but ultimately it happened for the glory of God, which takes me to one of my favorite stories, the miracle team of hockey. When we had Afghanistan and Iran and inflation, we were lining up for gas in the 1980s. If you remember, at the time, it was a bad time for America, and the Cold War was really getting really worse. President Carter boycotted the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, and somehow the Americans, USA, needed to hold on to something so that they could still find hope in the society. And they did during the Winter Olympics, because Russia, for several of them, about 4 Olympics, they took hold of the gold in hockey. There's no way. They even beat the All-Star NHL team of America. And of course, that's their lifetime, but they say it's their amateur. But for the first time, a bunch of college kids went and defeated the Russian hockey team. That's why it's called a miracle. You can watch that. It's one of the best Disney movies you can watch. But there's one scene in that picture where Herb Brooks, the coach, told his players, after pushing them into the ice to get ready, that one night, their nose bloodied because they've been going at it for hours. They were really tired. And Herb Brooks wanted to push them some more. The captain, Michael Eruziani, finally said, Michael Eruziani, Winthrop, Massachusetts. And Herb Brooks said, who do you play for? And Michael Eruziani said, I play for the United States of America. Of course, Herb Brooks said, you bunch of spoiled college kids, you brats. Don't you ever forget this. The name on the front of your jersey is a lot more important than the one on the back. Get that through your head. Never forget that. I think that's the greatest lesson of Hezekiah. It's not a church. You know what we can do? Because the name in front of us, which is Jesus Christ, we are Christians, that's the name in front of our jersey. It's the most important thing. It's more important than the name in the back, which in a particular case, our own Adventist church. When you learn that, you will know how glorious, how mighty, and victorious God is. So what are the 3 lessons from Hezekiah? We will learn radical worship. Let's get rid of all the idols in our lives, as sophisticated as they may be. And when that happens and God intervenes in our life, let's remember how good He has been so that we don't neglect His blessings and become prideful. And when we are at the end of our ropes, like Hezekiah, let's lay everything at God's feet. And when we do, remember, don't sit on your laurels. Be obedient and follow God, whatever His leading is. Like Hezekiah, build a tunnel, build a wall, have survival jars, and yet trust that God will defend you and protect you. That's the way we should approach prayer. Prayer has not been given for us to be indolent and lazy. Prayer has been given to us so that we can know the heart of God, and by knowing the heart of God, we can follow Him. Because like in our last illustration, the name in front of our jersey is more important than the name on our back. The final analysis, what really matters is the name of God and His glory. I hope we learned those lessons from Hezekiah. Fascinating story. May that improve our worship and our life with our Lord and our God. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Father, thank You for this lesson. What a wonderful narrative that we read, with archaeology backing it up, and Your intervention in so many impossible situations You came through. You always come through, Lord, when we depend on You. So teach us to depend on You, and always remember that all of this will happen not for our sake, but only for the sake of Your glory. Teach us to be true worshipers. Make everything that we do, even our obedience, redound only to Your worship and Your praise. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.